Well, I'm Carl Herndl, and I'm a professor in the English department at University of South Florida, and I'm also a faculty member in the Patel School of Global Sustainability, also at University of South Florida.
And tell me a little bit about some of your current research related to the rhetoric of science, technology, and medicine.
Well, I'm doing two kinds of research right now. One of them is largely theoretical, and one of them is largely pedagogical and applied. So my theoretical work really is in engagement with Bruno Latour's work. I taught a graduate seminar last semester on Bruno Latour and the new materialism, and I'm interested in Bruno Latour's whole theory of the non-modern, the move away from perspectival, epistemological concerns about certainty and 20th century theories of realism, and Latour's materialist theory of the non-modern. The notion of actants, the notion of reality is constructed through networks. I've been working on a kind of interesting comparison, and it's part of my paper for today, between Chuck Baserman's earlier work that goes back through Kuhn to Ludwig Fleck, behind Fleck to Kant, and Latour's work, by contrast, that goes back through Michel Serres and Alfred North Whitehead back to William James, and using their Baserman's and Latour's theory of reference, or discussion of reference, as a kind of interesting comparison between a 20th century modernist, humanist theory of rhetoric and rhetoric of science, and a non-modern, post-human and materialist theory of rhetoric and rhetoric of science that emerges from Latour. So I've spent a lot of time reading, thinking, and I'm now writing about Latour. I'm also, in the next 2 months, finishing a book for Oxford University Press that's going to be called The Green Reader, and it's a reader with a rhetoric in it that will be a textbook for undergraduate writing courses. And the book is organized around the topic of sustainability. There's a chapter on the rhetoric of sustainability and rhetorical theory, and then there are chapters on a variety of topoi and sustainability. So soil and water, energy, trash, stuff, the things you throw away, food, climate change, and one on ethics and personal responsibility. And the book is organized around explaining 3 or 4 crucial concepts that people need to know to understand sustainability. The concept of uncertainty, the concept of complex systems and systems analysis, and the technique or methodology of modeling and scenarios, which is a lot to try to teach college freshmen. But if they're really going to understand sustainability and understand climate change, they have to understand those 3 concepts. So I'm working on that. I'm also, since I work in the Patel School of Global Sustainability, which is a kind of applied science project, as a faculty member and a researcher in that school, I do a lot of work on applied sustainability and urban systems development. Right now I'm working mostly on citizen and community participation in technology development, partly as a rhetorical and research project, partly as just a practical project of how do we do this, so that when we help design sustainable communities, the community belongs to the people who live there rather than is imposed by a bunch of Western engineers, intellectuals, designers. Most of our work is in sub-Saharan Africa and coastal Latin America. So that's what those are the 3 kinds of things I'm working on.
So what drew you to research the rhetoric of science, technology, and medicine way back when you got started in the field?
In Marxism and literature, Raymond Williams says in the introduction, he says, nobody becomes a Marxist for abstract theoretical reasons. They become a Marxist because of practical personal experience. So I'd been reading Foucault's archaeology and reading Foucault's Birth of the Clinic, and had come to realize that science was the dominant episteme of the 20th century. Great realization. And Foucault's notion of the rarefication of statements, for example, and the historical development of medicine in the clinic, made me really interested in the notion that with Foucault's ideas, then science as the dominant epistemic regime of the 20th century was a highly regulated, highly disciplined way of generating knowledge and who we are. And that struck me as really interesting. At the same time, I've been a backpacker, canoeer, climber all my life until I got too old and too busy to do much of it. And in 1996, I published a book called Green Culture, which is a book on environmental rhetoric. Partly because, like other environmentalists in rhetoric and rhetoric of science, it's something I cared about deeply. I went out, you know, I'm camping and the water is polluted. You know, I'm climbing and the ecosystem's been damaged. So I came to Rhetoric of Science partly as an intellectual project and partly, as William says, because it was a series of things that I'm really interested in. More personally, early on, back in the mid-90s, my wife was diagnosed with breast cancer, and we spent 2 years in medical treatment, and I read all the journals in oncology and reviews of oncology, New England Journal of Medicine, to learn about cancer, cancer treatment, oncological regimes. And there was a moment when we were talking to the oncologist and we were asking her about cancer. She was brilliant. And she said, well, there isn't such a thing as cancer. There are lots of things get lumped in as cancer. We don't know what causes them. We don't know why chemotherapy works. All we can do is tell you that from observation, when you do this, when you treat someone this way, you have this statistical possibility of this outcome. And it occurred to me then that the 20th century notion of science and objectivity and certainty and knowledge was a myth, and that actually medicine and most science is really what I now call, when people ask me what science is, I say it's really the management of uncertainty. And rhetoric has always been a discipline that was for managing, engaging, deliberating about things which are uncertain. And if you think about science not as the discovery of truth, objectivity, and certainty, and very, very few of the working scientists I work with, and I work with lots of scientists, think that. They will all nod their heads and agree when I say, look, science is really about managing uncertainty, and people in rhetoric are pretty good at that. So those are the kinds of reasons I got interested in rhetoric of science, personal and intellectual.
So what can you tell me about the history of ARST and your involvement with it? And do you recall any memorable moments from past ARST meetings?
Well, my engagement with ARST is embarrassing, a little late coming. I was in an English department with a travel budget of $500 a year, and I went to the Four Seas conference, and that was it. I started coming to ARST largely through the auspices of my friend and colleague Greg Wilson, who had been coming to ARST and kept telling me what a wonderful group it was and that I needed to start coming. And I really only came to ARST for the first time, to the conference itself, about 5 or 6 years ago, largely because Greg told me there was this interdisciplinary group of really smart people I needed to come be part of. So that's, I can't give you a whole lot of the history. Because of being in an English department and back then not having any money to travel, I'm a late comer to the group, late to the party.
What significant tensions or intellectual sticking points stand out for you over the last 20 years of the rhetoric of science, technology, and medicine subfield?
Now, the two that strike me as sticking point, 2 or 3. The big one that everybody's going to mention, of course, is the Gonekar affair in the Gross and Keith book, Rhetoric and Hermeneutics, where Gonekar argues that there's no such thing as rhetoric of science. But intellectually, or kind of in my classrooms, the sticking points were first the conflict between postmodern, post-structural theory and the kind of realities of science and what it did and its success, what it achieved. So, for lack of a better term, and again I'm following Latour here from the beginning of Pandora's Hope, a theory of realism. And if you look at texts in Rhetoric of Science, everyone is struggling with how to talk about the relationship between language and rhetoric on the one hand and an external world on the other. In Pandora's Hope, Latour characterizes this as the brain in a vat that is completely divorced from the world, yet expected to provide completely certain knowledge of that separate outside world. So I think Rhetoric of Science was bedeviled by the problem of realism. And the other kind of intellectual problem was the question of relativism. Does discourse, does rhetoric get waylaid, if you will, by postmodern, ludic postmodern theory, so that you get pushed into a kind of radical relativism, so that you're stuck in what the philosopher Richard Bernstein calls the very reduced notion of rationality between Cartesian certainty and absolute relativism that forgets that whole middle ground that's rhetoric, that's praxis, that's practical reasoning. Barbara Herrnstein-Smith has a really wonderful discussion of this in her book, The Dynamics of Contemporary Intellectual Debate, where she talks about the fallacy of the charges of relativism. And Bernstein's wonderful with this too. And his term for it is that we inherit what he calls Cartesian anxiety. You know, it's an all or nothing, either absolute objectivity and certainty, which a whole bunch of us, of course, opened up as fallacious and impossible, and then the kind of response that you saw during the science wars, that the alternative was irrationality, pure relativism, and the difficulty of getting people to see, accept, and to articulate a practical, I will say pragmatic, alternative to either of those mutually exclusive options. Those were, for me, for the last 20 years, the sticking points. I think there's another one that's emerging in contemporary rhetoric of science, and for lack of a better word, I'm going to say climate change. The sticking point is there's a disaster coming down the pike. All those hybrids, those imbroglios that Latour talks about, you know, are the return of the repressed. And those of us in rhetoric of science need not only to participate, but a very difficult project. How do we turn our theoretical, our intellectual, our historical insight and knowledge into the practice, the project, the discourse of science, into skills and strategies that will help policymakers and scientists engage with and manage the uncertainty and make some headway on these problems that are difficult for those of us in America, but are life and death issues for people in the developing world, in developing countries. So that's the current sticking point for me. It can't just be an intellectual or academic exercise, which I'm not saying to dismiss it, but it has to engage in ways, rhetoric of science has to engage in ways it's never done before.
What were the biggest challenges facing rhetoric of science as it began to develop? And what do you see as some of the biggest challenges for scholars today?
Well, originally, nobody knew what rhetoric of science was. It didn't have a disciplinary home. People did it, you know, in English departments and speech departments. You know, often, I can't speak quite so accurately about speech departments, but in English you were an outlier. You probably still are, but didn't really have a disciplinary home, as Bill Keith and Bill Reig have published recently in their review of rhetoric of science and argumentation. It didn't have a methodology. It didn't have a set of central research questions, foci, so it was all over the map. A lot of interesting, smart work being done, but with no kind of core intellectual project. And I think it was also, because of that, really hard to find funding, to get articles published in journals, to get books accepted by publishers. Those were the kind of problems as you're inventing a subfield.
What do you see as your biggest contribution to the subfield?
Yeah. The work, that's a good pairing of two questions. I'm going to argue in some ways that I'm a late bloomer, or a very late bloomer, and engage in a little of shameless self-promotion. My contribution, if I'm going to make one, is actually what I'm working on right now. And right now I work in the Patel School of Global Sustainability at USF, and we're an interdisciplinary project, and we work on water and energy and urban space, the notion of urban metabolism, largely in developing countries, sub-Saharan Africa, coastal Latin America, to some extent in Asia. And the work I do there involves two things. One, it involves working on the kind of hybrid problems that Latour talks about. So sustainability is a hybrid problem. Climate change is a hybrid. It's not a human problem. It's not a natural problem. And as I've said when we're talking about the new college we've proposed, sustainability is not a technical problem. It certainly has technical aspects, but it's also a social, a political, a human, an ethical problem. So the work that I do on sustainability right now and community development and change are tied to what Latour would call in that famous essay, Why Has Critique Run Out of Steam? He says the critic has to be someone who works on matters of concern and brings things together in a thing, a gathering. And that's really what I'm doing in this Patel School. And if I have a contribution to make, it's going to be the fact that right now we're moving, thanks to a $12 million endowment, from a school to a college. And I'm one of the two people designing this new college. And within this new college, there will be an Institute for Applied Rhetoric of Science and Sustainability that I will get to design and direct. And I'm going to articulate a series of 4 research foci for that college. Those being, let me see, citizen and community participation in technology development, science and policy, which is the holy grail of all applied or mission-oriented science. You know, doing good science is not enough. You have to have an effect on policy. That's the holy grail for applied science. Data visualization and its communicative possibilities, and modeling. Modeling is how we've moved from 20th to 21st century science. And modeling has a set of affordances and liabilities that 20th century science, its argumentation, experimental science, didn't have. So those are the 4 kind of research issues. But the Institute and the college will also be a gathering place. Our college will have no departments. It'll have problem-driven work teams where people get together, develop unique new ways of identifying and addressing problems in urban sustainability, water, food, energy, and people in rhetoric will be at the table as equal players in defining those problems, writing the research grants, doing the research, and publishing with the people in engineering, with the people in the hard sciences, with the people in environmental science. So if I make a contribution, it will be creating a model for how rhetoric of science can actually be engaged, as Collins and Evans would say, upstream of science, part of the everyday important work of doing science, defining its projects, its goals, of working with communities so that people who do rhetoric of science like me will be full-fledged, full-time members of large, distributed, transdisciplinary work teams. I think that is the ideal. I don't think we do it now, and I'm trying to build literally a structure and a mechanism to create that and to make it permanent, make it, if I can say this, sustainable.
So you've already hinted a little bit about how rhetoric manages uncertainty and rhetoric responds to sort of the postmodern challenge. What else does rhetoric add to studies of science, technology, and medicine?
Now, partly I'm going to parrot back some of your question because it's what I had been talking about. If science is really, as I think it is, the management of uncertainty and the exploration of possibilities that haven't happened yet, modeling in its scenario work, rhetoric is really good at helping people understand, manage, and articulate uncertainty and try to come to ways of acting under conditions of uncertainty. Rhetoric has a kind of disciplinary technology for understanding change and the dynamics of change, for understanding what motivates people to take action. So, for example, the 20th century and Enlightenment notion that you give people a whole lot of facts and they will therefore change their minds and do what you want them to do, what in environmental communication is called the rationalist paradox. Slavoj Žižek calls that cynical reasoning, acting as if you didn't know. Well, rhetoric pays attention in ways that most of the sciences and engineering don't, to the fallacy of, communication as education, communication as giving people facts, and thinks about the affective, the moral, the personal ways in which you have to address people along with facts. It has a different way of dealing with publics or with policymakers other than the deficit model of, if you listen to us, we tell you the truth, then you'll know what we know and act accordingly. So rhetoric also, of course, brings a much more nuanced understanding of context, historical, material, and discursive context to the study, and I would say the activities of, the practice of science and engineering than most, not all, scientists and engineers are familiar with. Some of them are stunningly good rhetoricians without knowing it. And the last thing I would say about rhetoric, and this is about rhetoricians, not rhetoric itself as a discipline. Some of us are really good at being transdisciplinary, at moving between multiple disciplines, at seeing science from the kind of inside outside, from being part of a research team, understanding the science, and in a collegial, friendly way, also being someone from the outside, so that you can sometimes see things and articulate things, trivial cliche. You can see the forest instead of just the trees. And often, immersed in a project, a scientist or engineer is focused on his or her discipline and his or her research project. And I'm not suggesting we're smarter than they are, but we're located differently. And rhetoric, the discipline, and being a rhetorician, moving around the university, working in different groups, sometimes, or it can give us a kind of intellectual, ecumenicalness, an intellectual perspective that allows us to see things that others don't.
So earlier you said that the holy grail for science is to affect policy. Is that what you see the telos of rhetoric of science being? Is that the optimal telos?
I can't privilege just one. I'm working on The Green Reader, which is a textbook. So certainly, and this is my most utopian position, certainly rhetoric of science has an important pedagogical job in the university. Teaching people to understand how science works, how language and science interact, debates about science and climate change. Certainly we have, I think, engagement with the public, both citizens and communities and with policymakers, is the place where theoretical work has to go to work, where the rubber meets the road, where we have to be able to help our colleagues and friends who do science manage those problems and create not informed citizens, but bring citizens into the discussion and the development of science and try, to reduce the kind of chasm between science and policy. So two ways of thinking about that. My university has a big grant called CACHE, Coastal Areas Climate Change Education. And the theory was that they would go out and educate people about climate change by explaining the science to them. And those of us who are in rhetoric were working with that group, helping them understand that that wasn't going to work. That's what you've been doing and doing and doing. It doesn't build trust, it doesn't change minds, and it doesn't motivate people to act. That kind of technocratic top-down, here are the facts, isn't going to work. And one of our jobs as people who do rhetoric and rhetoric of science is to help groups like that reevaluate what it means to even say we're going to do coastal areas climate change education. You might say coastal areas climate change dialogue instead. The other thing that we might want to think about, other than just the continual historical and theoretical work that's valuable and will continue happening, is to try to figure out how, as Latour says in the book Politics of Nature, how do you bring politics back into science, or science back into politics? The problem, of course, is science, the authority, the epistemic authority, the social authority, the ethos of science developed in the Enlightenment by separating itself from politics completely. And my argument is that that's a tragic structure, that right now we need science and policy to work together, and tragically science and policy historically have been separated. And one of the things we need to think about how to approach as people who do rhetoric of science is changing that situation so that science can both be more engaged in politics and politics can be more engaged in a thoughtful way with science, so that really, as I've said, the holy grail of any kind of applied or mission-oriented science is creating policy. When I worked in sustainable biofuels development in Iowa, all the scientists knew that they could do their work, but until we got good policy, their work went nowhere. It was just buried in journals. And that's an absolutely pressing problem that the scientists, the scientific community, doesn't have the resources and in many ways doesn't have the will to change, that I think we need to help them work on.
So you've hinted at this, again, kind of future directions for rhetoric of science with the constellation of problems that circulates around climate change. What other future directions, either topically or methodologically, do you see for rhetoric of science, technology, and medicine?
You could look at climate change, but climate change is only the most recent avatar of the kind of hybrid problems, AIDS being the version, the important, crucial project in the 90s and early aughts that a lot of people in rhetoric of science, like Blake Scott, worked on. I don't want to name just one, and certainly climate change is one. I prefer the term ecocide that lots of people use. The notion that our engagement with the natural world through technology tends to create unintended consequences that we don't understand and don't know how to deal with. The problem that we need to make policy right now, today, when in fact knowledge or scientific data findings take 10, 15, 20 years to be made. The time scale between doing good science and doing policy are very different, and managing that uncertainty, figuring out how to act, under conditions of uncertainty, is one of the major challenges of rhetoric of science, of science studies, of science policy. So at the risk of sounding like I'm dismissing the work of my colleagues who've kind of invented the field, who are doing textual studies, who are working in libraries, who are working on history, that's absolutely invaluable work. I think that work will go on, needs to go on, so that we understand what science is, how it argues, how it talks. I think the new, or the newly pressing problem and direction is, as I've said, to engage with science and engineering and policy and communities, to work on change, to work on solving some of these problems. That hasn't been as pressing perhaps in the past, and it hasn't been as viable an option as it has in the past. It's not something we as academics have been trained to do, and that's going to require a lot of rethinking, retraining, developing new skills. It certainly has for me. I was mostly trained as a theorist, and now I'm doing applied work, and I find there are a whole suite of skills and strategies that I need that I don't know, and I make up on the fly. And I'm trying to make sure that my doctoral students are getting PhDs, understand theory and understand the history of the discipline, but also have those practical and applied skills. Some of my doctoral students in rhetoric of science are not looking for academic jobs. They want to be rhetoricians who practice in NGOs and in large government agencies. Those are career paths and skill sets and ideas that are relatively new, I think, to rhetoric of science. And I think that's one of our futures.